Good morning, and thank you for joining me for 5 Good Minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and today we're beginning our study of the Minor Prophets. And we'll be studying the Minor Prophets for quite a few weeks because there's a lot of material to cover there, and yet I hope it'll be an enjoyable study for you. The Minor Prophets write like no one else writes. Not in the history of human literature. This really is stellar literary output that we're going to be looking at, and the words from God that address directly political events, social upheavals. It's such a timely study to look at the minor prophets. Why are they called minor? Because they're less important than the major prophets? Not at all. In fact, they clearly are equally important and sometimes clearly highly influential on the major prophets. It's just their books are shorter. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, those are longer books. Especially, Jeremiah's output and the book of Isaiah. Those are longer books, and so they're called major prophets. The 12 minor prophets wrote much shorter books, although some of them are pretty long, like Hosea, Amos, Zechariah, Micah, are longer books than the others. They are generally shorter than the major prophets. When were the minor prophets writing their material? Well, from before Isaiah and all the way to the beginning of the intertestamental period. In fact, it's after Malachi stops writing that the intertestamental period begins, the period between the testaments. And so from somewhere around the 800s BC to the 400s BC are when they are writing. The major prophets are written to the southern kingdom, to the kingdom of Judah. But 6 of the minor prophets are written primarily to the northern kingdom. Some of the others are written to the southern kingdom, and others are written to the returnees, those who have returned from captivity after Babylonian captivity and are trying to establish a city-state again in Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So those are the recipients, although the nations are addressed, and primarily so in a couple of the minor prophets, the nations outside Judah or Israel. What do we mean when we talk about the divided kingdom, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom? Well, Saul was the king of the 12 tribes, the first king of the 12 tribes. And after Saul died, for the first few years of David's reign, he only reigned over the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. It took a while for the northern tribes to come on board and accept David as king, but they eventually did. David then ruled a united kingdom until his death. And a good rule of thumb in terms of dating these things, David reigned around the year 1000 BC, okay? And so when David died, Solomon, enlarged the kingdom, made the kingdom even more prosperous, and reigned over a united kingdom. But we also know about his many foreign wives. And so when Solomon died, although they were fat and happy and powerful, in terms of their economic success and their borders, and spiritually they were not in a good state. And as wise as he was, his son Rehoboam was not a wise king at all, and immediately became dictatorial in his reign, not wise at all, and alienated the northern tribes. And the 10 northern tribes under Jeroboam, who had worked previously for Solomon, basically led a workers' revolt. And the 10 northern tribes broke off and became a separate nation, and established their capital, not at Jerusalem, but at Samaria. And from then on, there are 2 separate nations, Judah and Israel. Israel being the 10 northern tribes, Judah being the 2 southern tribes. In fact, to keep the folks from Israel, the 10 northern tribes, from going back to Jerusalem every year, for the Passover and other observances. Not that that happened quite so religiously as it ought, because idolatry is such an issue in both kingdoms during the writing of the prophets. There was a second sanctuary set up in Samaria where people were supposed to be worshiping Yahweh, although he never permitted any of that, endorsed or authorized any of that. So you have two kingdoms. Sometimes they are allied together, sometimes they're not. The northern kingdom doesn't last nearly so long. It falls more than 100 years before the southern kingdom does, and is carried away into captivity more than 100 years before the southern kingdom is. We've got a lot more historical introduction to do. Generally, we'll pick up there next time. But I'm really looking forward to our study of the Minor Prophets. They're so relevant, they're so accessible, and they're so on point to the things that we're living through today. But to get that, we really do have to lay a nice groundwork of historical and cultural background before we dive in to our study of the Minor Prophets. We'll continue our introduction to these 12 wonderful books tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for 5 Good Minutes.